Bujun Ndinaway Maganitok, Nij Nishnabeg, Nij Marzik, Bangietagon in Ata Nishnabem, Gugut to Jishmayan, Giganos and Dijnakots, Nea Shimadigan and Donjaba, Midigan with them. We just Don Chanakanagay and Nungum. I'm grateful for the opportunity that's been extended for me to come and speak with you about Anishinaabe law and learning from the land. And I want to acknowledge the people who have put together this event this weekend. Good hearts I've felt as people have been up here speaking and as we've been visiting with one another. I also want to acknowledge Lenore and wonderful work that she does. And she's been someone I've admired my entire life. And I'm grateful for the example that she sets. I'm also thankful to be among family, and my Aunt Norma is here this evening, and she is someone I love dearly. And I know my mother would have wished to have been here this evening as well, but she's not feeling that well and not able to get out as much. It was nice to spend the last couple of days at Cape Croker visiting with her. As I came up the peninsula this morning too, I felt like Lenore. I felt that sense of acknowledgement of the beauty that lies around us here in this place. And I want to, as Lenore did, acknowledge the people who have preceded me in this place, on this traditional territory, and also look forward to coming generations. The talk I want to develop this evening, and there's going to be a short PowerPoint perhaps that's connected with this, but it's just pictures of the Cape Croker area. Because what's been happening the last few years is I've been taking students from Osgoode Hall Law School and the University of Toronto to Cape Croker to help introduce them to the idea that law isn't just found in parliamentary enactments. It's not just found in case books as judges write their opinions. It's not just found in regulations as drafted by ministries. Law is also something that is connected to the land and can be practiced and read from the land. So I take these students from Osgoode and U of T, and we spend 4 days at Cape Croker reading the land. The legal archive for Anishinaabe people is the earth and the water and the skies and the territory that surrounds us. And there's a literacy involved in learning how to read the land, the waters, the sky, the birds, the plants, etc. And that literacy is what I try to help introduce to them. I published a book in 2010 here called Drawing Out Law. And the idea is that there are many different sources of knowledge, the theme of this conference. And there are many different sources of law within Anishinaabe communities. And this is what I want to talk to you about in our brief time together, is where and how might you understand law from this place, from this territory. One of the things I love about being in this territory is the fact that people continue to appreciate how beautiful it is. Lenora was telling me before I came up here that Tobermory is identified as one of the most popular places for people to be able to come to in all of Canada. And I know that there's a challenge that surrounds that in terms of making sure that that impact is sustainable, but that challenge also provides an opportunity to help other people to see the sources of knowledge that are embedded in the land and the beauty that surrounds us. So these pictures will be going by at Cape Croker, and every once in a while I might stop and talk about them in a tangential way, as you'll see places that I can take these students to and draw out law. What's law? Standards for judgment. Criteria for measuring behavior. It's authority for making decisions. It's precedent. It's the wisdom that's found in the past that can be articulated in the present to be able to guide the future. Law has this broader meaning again than just what we would find in parliaments and courts and in regulation. And so when you look at the pictures of the escarpments, you're immediately taken back to a time of 440 million years ago, when this part of the world sat at the equator, and it was much like Australia, where the Great Barrier Reef is, where there's shallow seas, and in those shallow seas were all this life that was teeming across the land. And we recognize in seeing these escarpments the inundation of water that's been here from time to time to time, how it shaped our lives and it shaped the rocks, and we can see the transformation that happens with life. In some of these instances, these escarpments themselves were once living beings that have now been transformed and exist in this other place as we look across the Anishinaabe Nation, which is not only in Ontario, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but also in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And in that place of water, we have these stories that you've heard about how the Anishinaabe were interacting with this water as it was saturating this place, inundating this place. And we've heard about the recreation story a time or two as we've been gathered today. And that recreation story is a site and a source of law. When we tell that story, we find in the process which the Council of Animals followed in bringing the earth to pass as it is here, and in the principles that they applied as they were following that process, things that we can analogize to in the way that we might behave today. We look to that story and we find, again, standards for judgment, measurement, criteria, authority, precedent, as we take the past into the present to talk about the future. So imagine this earth being covered in water. I know you can see a little bit of a dark shading in there. Imagine a great turtle rising out of the depths of those waters and giving shelter to our figures that were there at that recreation on the back of that turtle, wondering what to do in this place when there's water all around and very little refuge to be able to get a firm footing on the earth. And so in this place, in that water, Nanabojo asked the divers to be able to go down and see if there's anything below. This is my Dodam, Nagigin Dodam. Otter was one of those divers that tried to find soil beneath the water to be able to bring up something that we could sit more comfortably on the earth. The story goes that these divers went down and one by one were unsuccessful. The otter wasn't able to bring up soil. The beaver, a mick here, wasn't able to bring up soil. Mong, the loon, wasn't able to bring up soil. Eventually the council was getting discouraged that there was no way to be able to find a footing, to be able to get our place in this world. And then the little muskrat spoke up. And all the other animals were not very happy that he would participate in this way, thinking that why would the muskrat be able to succeed when all these other great divers had failed? But Nanabojo said, no, let's listen to what he has to say. Sometimes the smallest amongst us that have the wisdom that's needed to be able to get through tough challenges that we face. And incidentally, these stories of these animals are often written across the sky. So when you look at the constellations in the night period, you're reminded of these cases. And you see in the skies the illustration of the things that we talk about in these recreation periods. And so here's this council that's trying to discourage the muskrat, but Nanabojo says, no, let's listen. And so muskrat dives, and he's gone for a long time. In fact, gone for so long that most of the council kind of forget and go about their own business on their own. Eventually, though, they see this little brown ball of fur pop up in the current and start drifting, and the animals swim over to the muskrat, and they find that the muskrat has perished. The muskrat's been down for so long, the air has got out of its lungs, and it's no longer living. they're sad. There's a great mourning in that council that this little one has given himself his very life to try to help his fellow beings to be able to bring something new out of something that's very unstable. They prepare him for burial, and in doing so, they see that he's like this as rigor mortis is starting to settle in. But as they unlock his little paws and prepare him for his journey along the path of souls leading to the land of the dead, they see there's little grains of sand in his paws. In fact, he succeeded in going down where the other more powerful divers weren't able to get. He was able to grab that soil and was able to bring it up to the surface. And so with that, the animals and Nanabojo, they planted that soil on the back of the turtle. And they started dancing around on the back of the turtle as they're preparing to celebrate what he brought into the world and also preparing to send him on his journey. And as they dance around the back of the turtle, the soil gets pushed into the organic matter on the turtle's back, and there's a spontaneous generation that occurs. From that soil that's mixed with the plant matter starts to grow the vegetation. It grows and then it decays, and the animals are all amazed, and they stand back from their dancing in a moment in thanksgiving. And then when it decays, they start dancing again, and the next time, because they're moving it around the earth, there's even more vegetation that grows that next time. And this goes on for some time. As you get the growth and the decay, you get a land that starts to form on the back of the turtle. Well, in the gratitude for that formation, you get the Nanabojo breathing life back into the little muskrat. The muskrat comes back to life and forms a part of the council of animals again. And the story continues, and it's a many volume story about how the recreation finds itself in this area. I'm just going to stop for a second. The next few pictures that are coming up are the 7 generations of my ancestors in this territory. When I did my Master's of Law degree, it was called a genealogy of law. And so I went back to Tecumseh. Tecumseh is my 3rd great uncle. His brother was married to someone called Wasagaboa. Wasagaboa is our relative. And the coming pictures that flow from here are the pictures that flow from the 3rd great generation to the 2nd, to my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my mother, myself, and then to my daughter. The point that I'm trying to make by putting these pictures up is that these stories have been passed down from generation to generation and remain alive as a legacy for us to be able to draw out law in the present. This is Peter Giganos Jones. So what you get is the muskrat coming up and this earth being reformed on the turtle's back. Great Turtle Island, as we often refer to North America as a Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. There's a place in Michigan called Michilimackinac. Mishik means big. Mackinac is a turtle. Michilimackinac is the place of the great turtle. And some people believe that's where the turtle settled out and the creation of the Anishinaabe, the recreation of the Anishinaabe earth in that place was formed. But I think you might be able to start to catch a glimpse as you listen to that story as how it could be a potential resource for how we might govern ourselves today. You think about the counseling process that was involved in that event. You think about the need to listen to those who are the smallest amongst us when we're involved in that counseling event. You think about the ceremony and the use of the land that occurred to be able to help it to grow and to bring it about. You can think about the way that Nanabojo intervened to ensure that there was not a domination of the more powerful animals in that place. And our governance structures as Anishinaabe people flow from those councils of animals. We are organized into clans, into dodems. My cousin, Darlene Johnson, who teaches at the University of British Columbia Law School, in talking with elders and in doing archival research, discovered that the first Anishinaabe that came out of the earth actually came from those different animals as they were dying. So when that great otter died, the people from the otter clan emerged out of the otter. When the beaver died, the otter clan emerged out of that. When the muskrat died, the muskrat emerged out of that. And her research shows that when settlers first came along, they didn't so much talk about Anishinaabe across a broad swath. They would talk about the otter people and the bear people and the beaver people and the muskrat people in recognition as to these places where they felt their genesis was found. So those are some of the sources, one of the sources that Indigenous peoples might look to be able to draw out law. And as Alan was talking this morning about that story of recreation being linked to language, in order to do that work, to be able to bring language back to life, there's a counseling that's necessary, there's a diving down that's necessary, there's paying attention to the little ones that are necessary. Right? There's again precedent, authority, criteria, standards for judgment that's found in these stories, and then they can be correlated with other different stories that come from those times. When you come to law school, if you learn a case, you learn a story. Right? There's some dispute, and the judge eventually looks at that dispute and tells about what the facts of that occasion are, and then makes a judgment as to how the law would apply to be able to resolve the facts that are in dispute before the parties. Well, in many ways, our stories are like those cases. You have facts, you have an issue in there, you have a resolution of the issue, and you have reasons that are given to be able to resolve that issue. And those reasons, like in the common law system, can be applied in subsequent cases. And just as if you went to law school, you couldn't think for 1 second that you could practice law by just knowing one story. You have to correlate hundreds of stories together. When they're triangulated, you start to see patterns as to how criteria for judgment, how processes would emerge. And when those patterns are evident, then you can practice law. So you put that one creation story beside the other stories from those times, and you see patterns for judgment, resources for reasoning, tools for teaching about how to live today because of those older stories. But we're fortunate as Anishinaabe people, like other peoples of the earth, we have many different sources of law. We have our agency when we make decisions. We're not just automaton. We have the opportunity to go to different sources of law. And so some of these other sources of law are those that are embedded in the earth. So there's this word in Anishinaabe for teaching, which is kikinomage win. And it means to point towards something and then take direction from that. That's our word for teaching. When you teach someone, you point them towards something, you take direction from that. There's a variation on that word, which is akinomagewin. Akinomagewin is from the root akit, which is the earth. You point to the earth and you take direction from the earth. It's another source of law, as I've mentioned. When you look at the plant and animal and rock and water life around us, we can learn the principles of judgment. This, incidentally, is Charles Giganos Jones, my great-grandfather. The sense of Akinomagewin is, again, this idea that you read the earth, you draw analogies from the earth. And I want to tell something about a weather phenomena that sometimes occurs at this season that might give you an insight to what I mean when I say you read the earth. We're just going through this period where we're going from winter into spring, as hopefully one day we'll get to summer. And this period of transition is a period when things start to melt, You get the flow of the water as it breaks up from the ice. And in that melting, there's a thawing that occurs. It's easier to be able to get around. And we say the water runs. There's this warming trend, this thaw idea. There's a word in Anishinaabe for that, which means warm and mild. It's abawa. Things are breaking up, loosening, thawing, running. It's easier to be able to get around. You sometimes know as that warm and mild period comes upon us that there's still those cold air masses that are present, and so you get mists that rise around us, right? And so sometimes it's quite foggy in the area as you get these transitions of the season. So sometimes this idea of the mists are attached to this warming and mild trend, but eventually they will disappear as there's more heat, as the seasons and the days lengthen out, and as there's more light, as the seasons and the days lengthen out. So that's Abawa. Our word for forgiveness, one of the words for forgiveness, is Abawa Waindum. Aindum is the idea of the process in your mind. It's the word for forgiveness, Abawa Waindum. What is the word for forgiveness? It's correlated to that weather feature that I'm talking to you about. When you think about forgiving someone, there's this idea that there's a loosening that happens between you, a warming trend in your relationship. There's a thaw that might start to occur. Things might break up a little bit, so it's easier to be able to run back and forth. There's a warming trend. It's milder in the way that you might deal with one another. But if you think about forgiveness and the way that weather phenomena teaches us about this concept, is that it's not just automatically overnight that you're able to see clearly and able to have things, the mists vanish before you. In a relationship, in order to have forgiveness, you also need that period where there's more heat and light that's applied so that you can enjoy what happens at the end of our season when we've come through the spring and those mists are no longer there. So this is just one example, but there are many different examples in our territory about how to behave in the world, how to guide ourselves in a legal fashion. This principle of law, again, is criteria, standards, measurements, ways of making judgment. And there are so many around us. Another one that I'm fascinated by is the fact that we live here on the Zagin Peninsula. You may know that Zagin is the word for the river mouth. Now think about river mouths and what happens at those places. It's often a place of great life. There's an abundance of energy there as all of this nutrients is collected off the land and eventually deposited into a bay. And where those nutrients gather, you get a real diversity and richness of plant life. And with that plant life, you get a richness and diversity of bird life that starts to interact with that plant life and that water. And with that, of course, are the insects and the fish. And you've got this real tight woven community there that's supported by the power of that river as it flows across that mountain. And then you get people that eventually gather there too, because there's a rich source of food that's present. Zagin. And that can mean a couple of things. It can mean to stick out, to be prominent, is one way of thinking about that. Another way of thinking about that is that our word for love is zagik. Zagin, zagik. What is love? How should we relate to one another? We should be like that river. How do we take the nutrients that are there in our lives and deliver them in that focused way to be able to create a richness in what is surrounding us in our community as you get different, not necessarily plant and animal and insect life, but richness in relationships, richness in the way that you preserve what's found on the land there in that place. So if you want to know how to love, you want to know what the law is in terms of relating in that way, you think about the river mouth. I hope next time you see the mists, you think about Anishinaabe law, and that people can read that weather phenomena and think, oh, there's standards for judgment. I need to make sure that I get myself in line with what that case, that legislation is telling me. Or when you see a river mouth next time, you might also think, what can I do to live in accordance with that principle? Because my understanding of our treaties, and you've seen these people, this is my mother and myself when I was a young boy. My understanding of these treaties is that we invited people to these lands to live in accordance with these traditions. You are invited to live in love. You are invited to live with forgiveness. This is my sister and my grandpa, Josh, Norma's father, and there's so much that was taught, although life is often hard, about love and forgiveness as these generations went through. This is myself and my daughter at a powwow. She's a jingle dress dancer, and so I'm hoping that these traditions continue to get passed on through the ages. A treaty is an opportunity to live in accordance with the laws of the earth. It's an opportunity to live in accordance with how these things might be recorded in the different wampum belts, the scrolls, the documents that are written in pen and ink, the things that are recorded on the earth. And when we live in that way, you and I can both be treaty people. There might be certain benefits that I would be able to receive from having entered into that treaty relationship with the Crown, the rights to be able to have our reserves protected, the rights to hunt and fish off of the reserves, education and health care, other social services are a part of that agreement. We also have the right to be able to access many different life elements there, but you have an invitation to be able to live in accordance with these beautiful teachings, the laws that are part of this place. So law is not only in these old-time stories that are from the time of recreation, and there's hundreds of them, but they're also currently with us, and they're there in the language, and they're there on the earth. Well, in order to apply these laws, we often need to talk with one another about what they mean. You can tell a story, but a story is not self-enforcing. You can give a teaching that's related to the land and the language, but it's not self-enforcing. When you think about treaties, they're often this idea, as long as the river flows. Suddenly you're talking about the river mouths and embedding that in our relationship. As long as the grass grows and the sun shines. But in those relationships, we have to talk with one another about what they mean. In other words, we have to be persuasive. We have to deliberate. Another source of law is deliberation. It's talking with one another. It's persuading one another. And when you bring these old stories into a contemporary setting, you also bring all our contemporary concerns into that setting, not just about what was there, but what is presently there. What does the Environmental Assessment Act maybe have to add? What are some of the best teachings that we've learned from the common law coming over? What about practices of gender equality that are being discussed in the world? In other words, when you're deliberating about these old things, you're having to be persuasive in the present context. I can't maybe just cite an old story and expect that will kind of rule the day. And when that occurs in the present, that means that our traditions are living traditions, because they have to take account of where we are right now to be able to go forward. There's this saying that tradition can be the dead faith of living people or the living faith of dead people. If we don't use our traditions by trying to apply them today, they become the dead faith of living people. But if we can put them into motion with all the messiness that requires, they become the living faith of those who preceded us, who walked that path of souls to the land of the dead. And make no mistake about it, there's a great degree of diversity within our communities. We don't see the world all in the same light. We have schools of thought within Anishinaabe communities. Some of us are more conservative, some of us are more liberal. And that's why we need law. Because we have these differences, we need processes to work through how we might see things in a different light, and we need principles to be able to work through how we might see things in a different light. This is one of the burial grounds at Cape Croker, and this is where my ancestors are laid to rest. And the point in making deliberation is to try to honor the spirits of what they've passed down to us and engage as much as possible in a respectful way of pulling law together. So one source of law is the sacred, another source of law is the earth, another source of law is our deliberation. Another source of law is like a chronicle, a rule, a proclamation, an affirmative saying, do this, don't do that. These might be somewhat similar if you were looking in from another legal tradition, saying, well, that looks a bit like regulation, that looks a bit like legislation, and so it is. People will repeat things like, when you take a deer, you leave something in return for that life being taken. That often can be tobacco, it might be other things. When you take that deer, you only take what's needed. When you take that first deer, you distribute it amongst the elders and those in need in the community in the first instance. That's like rules, regulations, legislation for how we might behave in that setting. Incidentally, the tobacco, when you receive it, often people take that in their left hand. The idea of that is that that's what's closest to your heart. And so when you're acting with tobacco, you're acting in remembrance that you need to do that with all your heart. But taking the tobacco in that way is also like that little muskrat that went down and grabbed the soil from the bottom of the waters, right? It's in your little paw there. And you're remembering that power of recreation that's a part of the teaching that's found in the seeding of the tobacco. So when we look at this, these issues that go through the generations with life and death, we can see that there are ways that we talked about how we might live. Another example, I recently did an Anishinaabe law camp with University of Western law students at Chippewa of the Thames First Nation. And they had a particular way of relating to their land that's different than what we do at Cape Croker. And I had to learn those sayings as I went into that place to make sure that when I was practicing law there, that I was doing it consistent with what their rules are. So I can't assume, just because I'm a Ojibwe, that the law is going to be practiced the same across Ojibwe territory. They're going to have their own ways of pulling that out. So that's another source of law, the positivistic, affirmative declarations, rules, chronicles, etc. Another source of law are customs. Customs are long-time ways of doing things that have just been passed down from people's behavior. And there's notions as to how you live in those patterns, and if you don't live in accordance with those patterns, you don't receive many of the opportunities, blessings, goodness that's found in that place. And sometimes we get people living that violate those customs, and there's great consequences that end up being harmful to those around us. Other times, when people live in accordance with those customs, like I said, they get those benefits. Customary law, when people might think about Indigenous law, may be the thing that they're familiar with. But I purposely tried to illustrate to you that, yes, custom is a part of the way our laws can be drawn out. It's one of our sources of knowledge, but it's so much richer than mere custom. What are the implications of this? The implications of this are that we are agents. We have agency as Indigenous peoples about how we pick up our law and measure what we do. Sometimes we might have the sacred be the leading point. And then someone might say, oh, that kind of correlates to what we see in nature. And then someone might say, no, but I see it this different way. And then you start into a deliberation process. And then through that deliberation, you might eventually come up with a rule where you proclaim something. That might be there for a while. Maybe it works, stays there for a long while. Sometimes, there's just situations we haven't taken account of. So you go back to the drawing board and you talk about the sacred again. You deliberate around the natural. In other words, these sources of law, these sources of knowledge, aren't just in silos with one another. They exist as a living system. Deb McGregor was talking to you this morning about the living system of Indigenous knowledge, including legal knowledge. And I think this is what she was referring to. What's exciting for me about the living nature of Indigenous law is the Supreme Court of Canada's own framework has developed ways to be able to start to think about how a conversation can go on between the common law and Indigenous law. As you may know, in 1982, Canada's Constitution recognized Aboriginal and treaty rights. Section 35 of our Constitution says the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. What does that mean? It means now that Aboriginal and treaty rights are the country's highest law. The federal government can't pass legislation to extinguish those rights. The provincial government can't pass legislation to extinguish those rights because the federal and provincial governments don't have authority to violate the Constitution. So it's the highest law of our land. Courts, in trying to develop how to interpret and give meaning to that section, said that Aboriginal rights is what they call intersocietal. Treaty rights is what they call intersocietal. It's a bridge, Section 35 is a bridge between the common law and Indigenous legal traditions, right? Intersocietal. The court, in a case called Vanderpeet in 1996, said a morally and politically defensible conception of Aboriginal rights will incorporate both legal perspectives. What a great challenge that presents to us that are living in our territories. To be able to pick up the work that you're doing in this beautiful place on our territory here in Tobermory and think about how will the wisdom of the common law help us create a sustainable, beautiful place that lives on into the future. But how might Anishinaabe law be there as well to create this sustainable, beautiful, lovely place that lives on into the future? The court says that the common law is helpful by way of analogy when you're doing this bridging function, but it's not determinative. It's not the final word. Likewise, Indigenous law is helpful by way of analogy, but it's not determinative either. The determinative nature comes from what you saw in the treaty bells this morning. The linking arms together, the joining of hearts, right? In the future, that treaty can be modeled on this land. In fact, I think Lenore has lived treaty in this place and been a model about linking arms together. And I know that she's expressed that appreciation this evening for how you feel like family to her. If we could get to that place where that is the way we related through treaty, we would be doing what our ancestors tried to do at those treaty councils all those generations before in creating intersocietal law and bridging across legal cultures. Morally and politically, legally defensible conceptions incorporate both perspectives. The court says reconciliation is the purposive goal of our constitutional relationships. And I'm grateful that we have all of these sources available to us that are rich in subtlety and rich in complexity. I have heard someone say in the last 6 months, nuance is sacred. And I'm coming to that view increasingly as my life goes by. When I was younger, I wanted the answer, I wanted the efficiency, I wanted the clarity, I still want some of those things. But I'm recognizing that if I go there and skate over the nuance, I've done damage to the very ends that I'm trying to reach by thinking about efficiency, by thinking about clarity, by thinking about those quicker ways of being in the world. We live in a beautiful world, and this world is described as a place of love, a place of forgiveness, a place of power, a place where we can draw the very meaning we take out of our life. And I'm not just meaning metaphysically, although I do mean metaphysically, I also mean materially. Because the legal processes that I'm talking about, while they connect to this broader worldview, they also are human processes, right? The reasoning, deliberation idea is a human process. Understanding how we describe the earth and our stories and those rules and our customs are also there. Our agency is engaged. We have so much opportunity. And when I am in this place, I feel the strength of the earth around us. I feel the cleansing nature of the waters. I feel the wind as it clears my mind. I see the faces of our ancestors in the very rocks. And those teachings are throughout our land. And I am grateful that we live here. I'm grateful for this evening together. Miigwech Bazinuwe, meet you. Thank you.